I'm very honored to be up here to share some thoughts with you in this science symposium. We will talk some science, but from a very different perspective. Due to Western notions of time, we won't get into all the preliminaries and comments and Trump jokes and so on. We'll get right down into it. I hope you all had enough rest and didn't stay out too late last night, because we're going to load your minds. If you don't come out of this room afterwards, kind of scratching your head, you must have been out too late and didn't cut. But we're going to load your minds, so be ready for it, and in a very short period of time. The starting point I want to make is, you've all been in conversations in one context or another where somebody challenges you or you challenge somebody in a conversation and you ask them, well, where did you find that out? How come you came to know that? And they say, science said this. And that usually is the end of the conversation, because science said it. Well, my first point, and we'll get to it at the very end too, is I want you to keep this thing kind of in perspective, and as we quickly go through the slides. And that is, a lot of people misunderstand what science is about and mistake it for technology. Keep in mind that science is about a search for reality. In other words, we know so much, and science's job is kind of pushing the envelope, looking into the unknown. On the other hand, technology is the application of the known. Okay? And a lot of people misunderstand those two basic concepts. So keep that in mind, and we'll come back to those notions about science and technology at the end. But let's quickly go through the slides, and we're going to, as we said, load your minds. If my favorite scientist, Einstein, is correct, when he was looking for and came around with his big discoveries about relativity, Einstein did not continue to do the same old. He did not continue to just do more mathematics and so on. What he really questioned was the foundational basis of science. And that's what our presentation is going to be about. So let's go through the metaphysics of our present existence and scientific way of thinking is comes from the age of reason. The metaphysics of modern Western world are based on a stagnant worldview. Remember Einstein? God does not play dice with the universe. And everything is about matter. Everything is inanimate except for you and I, of course, and those few animals that are running around out there. We look at things in isolation. We never look at them in a holistic manner. We are very future-oriented. In other words, been there, done, did it, thinking about the past. And we're always looking forward. All of the above is captured in the language we speak, like English. English is a very noun-based language. And lastly, our main reference in the back of our minds, not always articulated, is the notion of time. These metaphysics give birth to social values such as bigger, newer, faster, higher, more, and so on. These in turn are based on the thinking of the Enlightenment era or the Age of Reason. That's where these things came from, those foundational bases. The Age of Reason came into existence during the 16th century, or started to really bloom, at least at that time. It was a paradigmatic and ideological and philosophical movement, so to speak. It was about rationalism, a belief that you can come to know or arrive at truth strictly through reason, as opposed to faith, reliance on the past, intuition, and metaphysics. It gave rise to deism. In other words, we can come to know everything through our gift of reason from God. In other words, the church jumped on the bandwagon. God made an orderly universe, and it is good and beautiful. Remember, God does not play dice with the universe. See? Now, what are the ramifications of those and implications of the Age of Reason? Well, the Age of Reason, it seems, was a counter-movement to the old establishment of the divine rule of kings and reliance on tradition. It attempted to subject anything and everything to rationalism. It did away with the subjective and dealt with only the objective. It did away with emotions and feelings. For instance, women were too emotional and to be scientists and leaders. Separation of church and state came into existence as a result. The science method that we use today comes from that era. Mysticism, miracles, ghosts, and the like were frowned upon. See? Measurement, and hence the role of mathematics, became the foundation of the scientific method. Experimentation and pure reason can bring about knowledge. For instance, the Higgs particle in quantum physics is all propositional when you think about it. And the scientists say, hey, through our reasoning, in other words, our formula, the Higgs particle should be occupying a particular space, and its weight should be this, see? In other words, the kind of knowledge that we follow through with and arises out of this Age of Reason is very, very propositional. See? There is no room for anything that cannot be measured, so feelings, dreams, and so on are unmeasurable, therefore not scientific. See? So, continuing with the ramifications, scholars like Ian McGilchrist suggest that we have become largely left-brain thinkers. Our thinking is about control and manipulation, abstraction, anonymity, organizability, predictability, and financial balance sheets. In the process, justice gets interpreted simply as equality. The left brain does not understand things, but simply processes them. The right brain is the base of understanding. The left brain prefers the explicit, not knowing that making things explicit is like explaining a joke. Do you see the point? Our approach to knowledge is largely declaratory and propositional and not experiential at all. We are not denying the benefits and advances brought about by our present left-brain metaphysics, but most of that is materiality. Is our present metaphysics improving and advancing our species? Are we happier? In other words, are we as a human species going to be around in 200 years? Are we just a passing phase and so on? Well, it's sad to say where, for instance, McGilchrist tells of a teacher who was having to teach students how to read facial expressions. Yeah. Think about that. Are we becoming increasingly robotized? Is that what we want to turn out of our institutions, the universities? Because our universities are based on those principles and metaphysics of the age of reason. Von Goethe, at his time, attempted to challenge some of those metaphysics from the age of reason, but he was pushed aside. Then, in the early 1900s, quantum physics came on the scene. It is about uncertainty, particle-wave duality, non-locality, constant motion, probability, and even spirituality, even though the scientists don't like to say that out loud, okay? Now, the age of reason was in full bloom at the time of colonization of North America. Because native science was about wholeness, spirituality, waves as opposed to particles, everything being about relationships, and everything being animate. It was totally discounted by the rationalists because it was not about measurement and mathematics. It was nothing but mythology. It was not taken seriously. But let's take another look now. Native people, like quantum physics, think in constant motion, constant flux. That's one of the foundational bases of native thought. The world, that existence, is really about energy waves compared to the notion of matter and particles. In the native world, I know in Blackfoot this to be true, and I know in Cree and other native languages that it is also true. There is nothing that's inanimate. Everything is animate. Whereas in Western thought, as we've mentioned, only you and I and a few other sentient beings are animate. Everything else is inanimate. In the native world, if you look at it from this flux notion, everything is related. Whereas in Western thinking, we always try to separate. We always try to look at things in isolation, say. In the native world, everything has to be renewed. The knowledge, the love, and so on. Things like that have to be renewed all the time. That's why we tell the same stories, we do the same ceremonies, we sing the same songs. And even if you listen to native songs, our songs are very repetitive. See, it's about renewal. See, and see, the thing is, it's a realization that we live in a very narrow spectrum of existence, ideal conditions that make for you and I to exist. If you don't believe it, stop breathing for 10 minutes. Try and live underwater or remove water. See, we live in a very ideal conditions. And the notion of renewal is an attempt to renew those conditions that make for our continuing existence. So one of the big things behind native science is sustainability. Because of the notion of constant motion, constant flux, space becomes very important. Place becomes very important because land, for instance, is a little bit more stable, and therefore I can refer to it and use it as a reference point, see. Whereas in Western thought, time is our major reference point. Native thought, it's place, see. So, and of course, the language that we speak is also oriented to those ways of thinking. You know, English, it's just as one example. The ordinary English sentence is A is B, okay? A equals B. Well, from a native perspective, if A equals B, the question arises, then why do you need B? See? So, and that's because in English, the propositional notion, see, whereas in the native language, it's all about action, it's all about process, it's all about describing really what's happening, so on. Big differences in thought processes. If you compare native science and quantum physics, you will find that in Western thought, we think that there's an underlying order, and that's what Einstein was trying to discover. And if there's any chaos, it's us that are causing the chaos. Whereas in the native process, in the native world, there's an underlying chaos. There may be an order, but we're too small, and our computers, our minds are too small to realize any order. But generally, it's an underlying chaos, and our culture is an attempt to try and bring about order in the chaos that arises out of the flux notion. See? So, very different way of thinking. If we were just to go down a few notions to again show the difference, you'll find that in quantum physics, consciousness does affect reality notions. Native science, yes. In quantum physics, matter objects are space-time curvatures. In native worlds, they're mere descriptions. Okay. Time, space-time is a continuum. In the native world, time it just is. Matter, particle wave duality. In the native world, it's about energy waves. There's no deep reality in quantum physics. In the native world, everything is subjective, in spite of the fact that we may struggle for objectivity. Everything you know comes through this process, through this mind. So therefore, all knowledge is subjective. Cause and effect in the Western world is a paradox. In the native world, it's either all cause or it's either all effect. We have a very reductionist perspective. The native world has a very holistic perspective. We have experiment and proof in Western science. It's kind of like trying to hurry nature along. It's long-term observations in native science. Knowledge is cumulative in the native world. In the Western world. And in the native world, hey, we always have to be renewing. And in fact, we try to clear our minds. That's what our purification ceremonies, our sweat lodges and so on, are to try and clear the mind. Language is binary in the Western world. In the native world, it's all about process. If we were to stop and think, where is Western metaphysics taking us? Okay, since it's the dominant metaphysics, the dominant way of thinking in the present world, where is it taking us? We as Homo sapiens, are we better off as a result of it? Is it really advancing the reason for our existence? If we ever stop and think about that, is our current metaphysics just another passing phase? Maybe there are other metaphysics that we should take a good look at. Western science is largely aimed at exploration. It's kind of like at universities, academic freedom. I can ask anything, and I shouldn't be stopped from thinking about and researching anything. Native science is aimed at sustainability. We exist in a very narrow gap of ideal conditions. We need to maintain those conditions if we are to be around as long as the fish has. You know, the fish was around before the dinosaurs, okay? Where are the dinosaurs? Where's Neanderthal man? We used to text each other. Where is he now? See, are we going to be around? Well, the fish has been around for a long time. Have we ever asked the fish what his secret is? See, I have used Blackfoot Metaphysics to compare to quantum physics because the two have large areas overlap. Our universities are the present gatekeepers of knowledge, just like the church and monarchs used to be. But could it be that our gatekeeping methodology is out of date? Could it be that our left brain metaphysics is increasingly leading us to being tech schools and wandering further and further from our original mandate? In other words, pursuit of knowledge. That's what science is about. So let's stop and reflect on that. Blackfoot Metaphysics is waiting in the wings, say. Now, if we were to go back to our original opening statement about science and technology, see, these ways of thinking, these metaphysics that we never question, that underlie our approach to doing research and so on. Where, as we've said, are they taking us? Say, well, in my view, yes, they may have been useful 300-400 years ago, but I think they've run their course. Okay. Just like we do with our computers and our iPhones and smartphones, we need to do a little bit of updating. Say, and look at the very foundational basis of our science. In the native world, everything is about the relationships, okay? It's about relationships. Those relationships between those trees, the earth, those little plants, those buffalo out there, there's a whole relational network. We as scientists, have we ever stopped to say, let me sing a song to those plants? Just like Emoto used to talk about the water. If you talk nicely to the water, hey, you get one result. If you start to have bad thoughts and say bad things in the water, you do see the changes. See? Well, in our world, the earth, as we said, everything is animate, and the earth is our mother. Well, just think about it. How do we treat mom? Okay. And if we really looked at it from that point of view, I think our science would be very different. It would be about sustainability, least disturbance. In an earlier talk this year at the University of Calgary, we were giving them a similar view, a similar presentation, and what we try to impart to the audience, and what I'd like to impart to you as scientists, is, have you ever talked with somebody that's going through a midlife crisis, we all know whether they're relatives, they're friends, and a person going through a midlife crisis really asks themselves profound questions, such as, who am I? What is it all about? What am I doing? And we've heard people that have said, I think I'll sell everything and go around the world. In other words, do something different. We've heard people say, I'm stuck in this job that I've been doing for 30 years, and I hate it. But I'm stuck because I've got kids to raise. I've got a house to pay for, see? And then there's, of course, people that say, I love what I'm doing, and I think I'll continue, see? I think we're at that stage, especially in view of developments such as truth and reconciliation, where I think we should go and ask ourselves, just like in a midlife crisis situation, profound questions about our science and where that science is taking us. So that's the reason why we've titled our talk, Blackfoot Metaphysics is Waiting in the Wings. It's knowledge that's there but hasn't been tapped. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Long Fu. I'm with Alberta Environment and Parks. Dr. Littlebeer, I really want to thank you for your presentation. Many of us, when we study science, we got a PhD degree, and that means Doctor of Philosophy. But I'm not sure how often in our scientific research activities, how often we contemplate the philosophical questions you discussed in your presentation. So for that, I really want to thank you. In terms of how to connect Western science to indigenous wisdom, and I can see there's a long way to go, but we have hope. Yesterday, in David and Fred's presentation, they both emphasized integration. So that's about put pieces of information, scientific information, together to look at the bigger picture. I think that's what you refer as holistic knowledge. So my question is that we know that Alberta Environment and Parks has two panels, Indigenous Wisdom Panel and the Science Advisory Panel. And how, moving forward, that what we can do and you're thinking about we can work together, how we can connect the Western science and to indigenous wisdom.
Thank you for that question. Let me answer it this way. If we could think about a corporation, okay, usually there's a CEO up there in the hierarchy, and there's that person down here who works on all the little details and so on. It seems that the Western science approach, just as we pointed out, is about somebody that's busying themselves with all the micro factors, all the little details, okay? And the CEO is somebody that oversees and sees how there's a connection between this faction, this group, that office, and so on, and makes things gel, so to speak. Another similar example is a coach of a basketball or a hockey team. The hockey players may think they're doing great, okay? But it takes a smart coach to kind of see how the game is developing. So the coach always has to have that holistic view. It seems that this notion of isolation, reductionism, that leads to micromanagement, so to speak, and the bigger view, an overview, a holistic way of thinking, seeing how things relate, is really the best basis for cooperation between Western science and native science. Thank you.
Dr. Littlebear, I have to compliment you. I have never in my life heard such eloquence in describing the difference between the First Nations or Native view and Western science. So I want to first thank you for that very eloquent description, which then begs the question, if most of us sitting in this room have been through the standard education process, which you yourself have been and even were a part of, even while trying to change things, how would you recommend, I don't know, you can do that in a short answer or not, that science, like environmental science and other hard sciences like we're talking about in this oil sands symposium, how can we integrate that way of thinking, which from my understanding is experiential thinking? You have to live that lifestyle to fully understand it. Whereas with the Western way of thinking, it's what you learn in school from a book. Mm-hmm. Any comments on that?
It's not trying to, just brush the question aside, but a physicist that came to be a good friend, he's passed away now, some of you may know of David Bohm, who used to be a student of Einstein and so on. We had long conversations with David Bohm, and he'd been wrestling around these type of issues and questions in his mind. And he asked me the same question. And my quick and short answer to him was, why don't you learn Blackfoot? Speak Blackfoot, or Cree, or Ojibwe. And let me tell you, the very importance of that is because, if I can give you an example of it, is the very simple verb in English, to go. The verb to go in English. The linguist actually did a count of a Dene language, which was Navajo. And he found out that you can conjugate the verb to go 356,000 different ways in Navajo. And I know that to be very similar to Blackfoot. Okay. So, the language we speak, okay, it's almost as though English, or for that matter, any of the Euro languages, do not have that capacity, okay, consequently have to adopt a different language the different language being math, see. Math exists in Blackfoot and other language groups, but because of the richness, just like those 356,000 different ways, we can say things that are impossible to say and capture in English without jumping into math. Let me give you one further example that I always, point out to respond to these type of questions. If I were to say in English, dynamics without motion, that's an inherent contradiction. Well, an elder from Haida country, the issue came up, and he thought about it for a while, and he said, dynamics without motion, oh, that's easy to explain. He says, you go out on the ocean, far enough away where you can't see the land and use the land as a reference point, in other words, be out in the middle of the ocean. You know that your canoe is moving because you're rowing it, but 360 degrees around you, you're always the same distance from the horizon. Dynamics without motion. See, in other words, native languages can conceptualize, articulate ideas without having to reference numbers. So that would be, I hope that answers your question.